Hey guys, I'm the 50s Kid. This is a 2004 BMW 325 Ci. I call it Project Black Savage because it's the salvage BMW, haha. It needs to be smogged. It still has a couple of problems, a couple of DTC codes. It's got a P0507, which is an idle speed too high. It's got a P0171, which is really common. It's a lean condition, but it's a lean condition only on bank 1. And this is kind of strange. Usually when a P0171 pops up on this car, a 174 pops up as well, which is for bank 2. This is only for bank 1, which is kind of odd. You don't usually see a bank-specific lean condition on these vehicles. It's just not very common, but it can happen. So in this video, I want to just dive into these problems. I want to figure this out, and I want to do, we'll cover lean conditions again and what you should do to diagnose them, just again, in case you haven't seen some of my old videos on the subject. Anyway, let's get started. So I want to show you what's going on with the idle. Hopefully we've got enough juice in this battery to start this thing again. Okay, that's working. You can see we have a little bit of a bouncy idle at first. It goes a little higher, and then it eventually starts to settle down after a little bit. So now you can see it's sort of coming down, and basically it settles in around 950 RPMs, and it stays there. Even when the car warms up, it never gets down to 750 RPMs, which is where it should be. Let's see, if we go to drive, let's see what happens. So it does go down to 750 once we're in idle, once we're in drive. So at least there's that. See how it's just going back up once I'm in park? Kind of a little strange there. Eventually we're gonna get codes. We're gonna get pending codes for that 507, like I said. Also a P171. So like I said, this thing does have a P0171, which is a bank 1 lean code. So in order to diagnose lean codes, you want to actually use a scan tool that'll let you read live data. And my preferred scan tool is going to be an ELM 327 cable plugged into a laptop using ScanMaster ELM software. I'll put links in the description where you can get all these things. See if we have any trouble codes from last time. So there you go. There's the 171 and the 507. Looks like those are stored at this point. So hopefully we've got a freeze frame for the 171. Yeah, we have a freeze frame. So when you're diagnosing lean codes, you want to look at fuel trims, because fuel trims tell you how much, what percent extra fuel the engine is either adding or subtracting. In this case, you'll see that, well, okay, you also have a short-term and a long-term fuel trim. Let me just go over this again in case you guys haven't seen my fuel trims video and you don't understand what all this stuff is. You've got a short-term and a long-term fuel trim. We're going to graph these once we start the car. We're going to take a look at these a little more closely, but for each bank on the engine, and there are 2 banks. Bank 1 is going to be cylinders 1 through 3, and bank 2 is going to be cylinders 1 through 4. So 2 banks on the engine, each one has a short and a long-term fuel trim. The short-term fuel trim is what corrections being made to the car now. The long-term fuel trim is what corrections the car has learned to do over time. So whenever the long-term goes up, the short-term is going to go down. It's sort of like the long-term helps the short-term reset down to 0. So for instance, let's say you had 5% short-term fuel trim for a particularly long time. Eventually the engine learns, okay, we always need to be having 5% fuel trim, because that problem's just never going away. So it moves the 5% short-term fuel trim over to the long-term fuel trim. The long-term will go up to 5%, the short-term goes to 0. That way the short-term is able to correct for any future deviations beyond that 5% that the computer knows always needs to be there. So I hope that's a fairly decent, quick explanation. You'll see over here we've got 10% short term on bank 1, 10% long term on bank 1. And that's going to set our 171 code. Usually these need to get to around 25%, but you know, anywhere, anything plus 20%, and you're gonna be setting that code. And you can see right here on the short term, this is just 0.8% on the short. I'm sorry, on bank 2, it's 0.8% on the short and 11.7 on the long. So that is overall just about, you know, a little over 12, probably 13. That's not enough to set a bank, you know, a P0174. So, you know, looks like we definitely do have a problem on bank 1. Now, the coolant temperature was only 80 degrees, so we were not fully warmed up yet. The engine RPM was 987. This is that high RPM like I was talking about. You know, it never seems to actually go lower than this. So this fuel trim code is being set when the engine is just starting up. So what we need to do is we're going to graph this thing. We are going to graph our fuel trims and take a look at them and see what happens to them as the car warms up here. So I'm going to put bank 1 short term there, bank 1 long term there, and then put bank 2 short term here, bank 2 long term right there. When you're dealing with a lean condition, what you want to do is identify the type of lean condition that you have. So the way you do that is you run the engine at idle and you check out what your fuel trims are. Then you run the engine at speed and you see what happens to your fuel trims then. Run it at about 2,500 to 3,000 RPMs. And if your fuel trims go down, then you have a vacuum leak. If they go up, you have some other kind of lean condition, something that's probably fuel related. Clogged fuel injectors, clogged fuel filter, bad fuel pump, something like that. But if the fuel trims go down when you run the engine at speed, that is a vacuum leak. One other thing that's important to note is, and I did explain short term and long term before, to see the current total fuel trim, you want to add the short and the long term together. And you always want to look at short and long term for every engine. It doesn't matter what it is. If you only get used to looking at short trims and you ignore long terms, you're gonna miss something. So here's what our engine's looking like at idle. We're kind of warming up now. I'd like to actually wait until the engine fully warms up, but let's just go ahead and run the engine at speed and see what happens. So what did happen there? Nothing much. The short term went down, but the long term went up to compensate for it. We're seeing our high short terms coming up now, but that long term is still basically normal. Not what our freeze frame was showing us. Let's let this engine warm up completely, and let's just let's see what the fuel trims are telling us once we're kind of warmed up, since we did not catch whatever this event was when the engine was cold. Let's do this again. Let's take the engine to 2,500. You see our long terms go up, but the short terms are compensating for that, sort of. We still have about 10% total, maybe, yeah, it's about 9% total. You know, the strange thing about this system is that the long terms are actually correcting as we're hitting the gas pedal, which is kind of strange. On an M54 engine, that doesn't happen. You never see the long terms correct that quickly. It always takes a long time. You got to go out driving for 5 minutes for them to change at all. So it's usually a little simpler to kind of diagnose things. Only the short terms are changing. But on this one, on the M56, things are a little different. It's actually correcting long terms as quickly as it's correcting the short terms. And you know, that's just going to be different on every different kind of car you work on. That's why it's always important to look at the short and the long terms at the same time. You always got to do that. You don't want to just concentrate on shorts or longs, because you're definitely going to miss something. Another thing I think is odd is that we've got this negative long-term fuel trim and then positive short-term at idle. They're basically almost correcting for each other. It's, you know, about 2% in total, at least right now. We're fully warmed up right now. Let's just go ahead and repeat our test. Let's rev this thing to 2500. Let's see what happens. You can see we're basically perfect. 1%, we're 0, really. 0, 1, or 2. On bank 2, we're 0 as well. Let off the gas. See that long term's going negative, that short term's going positive. So this is more. There's 10, 11. So there's 18% minus 9. That's 25% right there. There we go. It pegged. It pegged really high. Wow, look at that. What is that? Why did it peg really high? Did the is the O2 sensor, did the O2 sensor go bad or something? What happened there? Did we get some kind of a vacuum leak? That was really strange, guys. What did we see? Right now we're seeing a total of, I don't know, 5, 6. Let's rev our engine again, see what happens. About 6 in total. Now we're 0-ish. Again, I'm looking at these two numbers here and adding them together. About 5, 6, 7, 8. Minus 17. So now the short term's climbing, going back up to 25. So this is definitely a vacuum leak of some kind, because we are way higher at idle than we are when we're running. We had to get this thing all the way warmed up, and now it's definitely pegging out the short term. The long term is not correcting for it. Again, you got to add these two together. So like 13 minus 9 is a total of 4. But when it was 25 minus 9, you know, that was still very, very high. So this thing definitely has a vacuum leak of some kind, and we've just got to find it. It either has a vacuum leak or it's got something really weird going on with the O2 sensor. But let's proceed on the idea that it's a vacuum leak. So guys, I actually took a look at this car a couple days ago and I tried to do an initial diagnosis on it. I did find that it had the vacuum leak, and I did do a smoke test on it. Smoke test is usually not something you can do at home, but I have built my own smoke machine, and I've done a video on how to make that, so I'll link that at the top of the screen. I did a smoke test, couldn't find the leak using the smoke test, which is pretty unusual. The other possibility is it could be that our O2 sensors are lying to the computer. The computer actually uses the O2 sensors to detect what happened with the combustion event right after it took place. So if the O2 sensors are sensing that things are a little rich or a little lean, they'll tell the computer to add or remove fuel so that the next ignition event actually occurs at the proper ratio. And that's what that fuel trim is. It's either adding or removing fuel in order to keep things in balance. Given the fact that we had a bank 1 only problem, it could be that that bank 1 sensor was bad. So what I did was I switched the bank 2 with the bank 1, because we knew that the bank 2 was good. If we saw that the problem moved, we would know that the O2 sensor was bad. But the problem did not move in this case. So we know that there is a confirmed problem on bank 1. There is a vacuum leak there, just can't find it. I'm going to go ahead and show you. I'm going to repeat the smoke test just so you can see what I'm talking about. We can confirm that, and just so you know I'm not crazy. Takes a minute or two for my smoke machine to warm up because I don't really have the professional smoke liquid. This is just mineral oil. But eventually when it gets warmed up, it does start to produce a lot of smoke. Okay, so we've got smoke going on, and we're going to introduce it into the brake hose. You can see that I've got a glove over the intake boot right here. And it's usually helpful to have a little light. And you just kind of look around and check for leaks. I see a little tiny one up on the top right here where this hose actually meets the little, I forget what they call it. I don't know if that is... I don't know that that would actually be enough to cause a vacuum leak. I'll try to get you guys handheld. That is really the only leak that I can see. The only smoke of any kind that I can see. Let me get you guys handheld and I'll show you what this looks like. So right there, you can see there's smoke coming from that. It's either right on top of that or maybe just below that. That's really the only thing that I can see. That is the only smoke on this whole engine. There's really no smoke anywhere else. So, I don't know if that smoke is coming from that line itself or maybe, again, just below it. Maybe we can sort of dislodge that line and see there's maybe a leak or a cut in the hose just below it. So sorry for the compressor noise, but you can see now that I've twisted this hose in a slightly different way, I've got a little smoke coming out of there now. So maybe this is it. So I did notice that the first time I did this test, guys, but I kind of dismissed it because it didn't look like much of a vacuum leak at the time. But once I twisted this hose around, I saw that it started leaking a lot more. So maybe that is it. One way we can confirm it is we're going to start the engine. We'll use a little carburetor cleaner. We'll spray around that area. If it's getting sucked in, we should hear the change in the engine speed. Oh. And that is all she wrote for the battery. I did get a new battery today at the junkyard, actually. But rather than hook it up, I'm gonna use my jump pack real quick. I am still rocking the Genius Boost from Noco. Really so handy to have this thing. I never really charge it. It just works. Okay, so we've got the carb clean. Just gonna spray it over around that area and see what happens. Well, I'm not hearing a substantial change in the engine speed, but that might not mean anything. We might need to actually check the fuel trims while we're doing that. So let me get the computer hooked up and we'll just check that out. Okay, got you guys sort of zoomed in where you can maybe see both these things happening at the same time. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna spray in that area. Did you see that? I think we found it, guys. Look at that. We totally found it. We totally found it. Wow. I totally dismissed that the first time around. I didn't think that tiny wisp of smoke that I initially saw coming from that was a big enough problem, was big enough to actually cause this vacuum leak, but you just saw it. That is the leak. I think that little part is called the sucking jet pump or the suction jet pump, something like that. So I'll have to go and get a new one. We'll install it, and hopefully that will fix the problem. Hopefully that fixes the idle. It's strange that that's only a bank 1 problem. It must be that wherever that line enters into the intake manifold, it must sort of enter in more on the bank 1 side than the bank 2 side. Bank 1 is cylinders 1 through 3, bank 2 is 4 through 6. So that must be what's happening, you know, and most of the error is only entering mostly on the bank 1 side. So yeah, really pretty interesting there. Not a common vacuum leak at all, but it just kind of shows you that anything can be a vacuum leak on these engines. So sometimes you can't actually find it by just looking at the common problems. I do have a video on the most common vacuum leaks, particularly on an M54 engine. But this one, little different, doesn't have a normal CCV system. The CCV system's integrated into the valve cover, so there are fewer and fewer places to check for leaks. There's no oil return line to the oil dipstick tube. So a lot of the normal vacuum leaks are actually not an issue on this engine. Another way that you can search for vacuum leaks is with that can of carb cleaner. Just spray on all the little connections, all the hoses, everything you can see, and sometimes you can find it. But most of the time on this particular engine, everything's hidden because of just the way the intake manifold is, you know, compared to like a V8 car or an inline 4 or something, maybe most inline 4s. The intake manifold's sort of hidden, you know, there are things coming out of the bottom of it, little hoses that you can't get to. There are vacuum tubes hooked to the back of it. So it's really pretty difficult to find with just spraying with carb cleaner or water. Water is another thing you can use. Any liquid that's going to get sucked into the engine and sort of change the way things are running. So that smoke test is really a valuable thing to be able to do. And as you see, in this case, the smoke test pinpointed the leak. So I'll go ahead, I'll get the part, we'll take care of it, and then I'll record a final wrap up. We'll see if this takes care of the idle problem, which hopefully it will. Anyway,